Okay, welcome. We have the somewhat unusual situation that the topic today follows the lecture on Friday, last Friday, namely Bela Greshkovich. I obviously will not repeat his lecture, but there will be overlaps, and since I don't fully agree, and he no longer fully agrees himself with his initial assessment of the problem. We have already assigned a piece by Kenneth Roberts, which it turns out I think Eötvös was the person who selected it, and it's an extremely interesting piece on the fate of economic populism, focusing on Peru. And a piece by Carlos de la Torre, which is a more general treatment of the forms of populism in Latin America. So we have other authors, two other sources that we will focus on, but it is Bela Greshkovich remains perhaps the main author with whom I will have a dialogue today. I kind of had one last time, but I think probably my style of having dialogues is not always the best, because he was a little defensive that, well, this is what you invited me to talk about. And of course, I invited him to talk about that, but in any case, there were some issues which I wanted to raise about economic populism being the definition, the basis of the definition of how we define the phenomena in general. That's kind of easy now, of course. He did this in '98 or even earlier in essay form. I remember in Telos, we once published a version of one of these chapters, chapter 6 of the Greshkovich book. And, he was doing this at the time, and subsequently, in retrospect, 20, 30 years later, it's possible to see the matter differently. In any case, I do want to begin very briefly with definitions of populism, this time not trying to present my own, which I've done too many times for you already, but rather to distinguish it in sociological, economic, and political definitions of populism. Gino Germani, what's the date of his book? It's falling apart, my volume. The English version was 1978, but of course written in Spanish earlier than that, was published at the height of the influence of sociological functionalism, modernization theory, another one dimension of that functionalist paradigm. And Gino Germani certainly belonged to that school. It's a brilliant book. And though many of my friends and colleagues now are highly critical of it, I always start out with the virtues of the volume, namely the multi-level causal explanation that one can find there, which I reconstruct. I've done this for you already. I'm not going to go into that. There is also, however, and this is what most of the debate about Germani seems to be about, his own definition of what populism is. I want to start with that. This is cited by everybody, or almost everybody in the literature. Multi-class coalition, which represents a form of primary mobilization, distinguished from fascist counter-mobilization. And it happens, and populist episodes take place at relatively early stages of modernization, Gino Germani argued. It is the last step that has been most severely criticized. I think very few people, Slavoj Žižek is one, who actually thinks that populism is a form of fascism. And so they attempt to distinguish fascist and and populist mobilization is almost generally accepted. I accept it too. And that it is a multi-class coalition, well, that's even a feature of Ernesto Laclau's depiction of what the phenomenon is all about. But the idea that it is a relatively early stage of modernization has been contested by lots of people, and Carlos de la Torre, my former student, is the one who has done this in the most determined way, suggesting that in that case, once primary mobilization is successful, or initial incorporation, as Carlos calls it, there would be no more populism anymore. And looking at his own country, which happens to be Ecuador, but probably looking at Peru, looking at Venezuela, one would have to judge this depiction and this restriction to a stage of mobilization, a stage of modernization, when a part of the population who's been entirely excluded from politics has been incorporated. No one denies that this was part of the phenomenon in Argentina, and probably Brazil and Mexico too, in the 1930s, associated with names like Vargas and Cardenas. But still, in all these countries, Mexico was the most modern of all of them, there would be no populism if it were only this. So this has been debated and contested. And the school, and this is what Bila Grešković is most influenced by, the school that comes up with another definition and meaning is the school that understands populism in terms of economic populism. This is not the position of those who focus on economic populism doesn't contradict Gino Germani with respect to Germani's own early period. Economic populism politically can use and does use multi-class coalition and mobilization of large numbers of people previously excluded. But in any case, this is not the essence of the phenomenon. To those who warned, let us say, in the 1980s and 90s of the return of populism in Latin America. That's Guillermo O'Donnell's idea of the cycle. After democratization, the danger is that populism will again return, leading again to oligarchic and even authoritarian rule, O'Donnell's cycle. But as far as many others like Jeffrey Sachs were concerned, the problem now is beyond Latin America and its cycle, and is relevant also to the Central European countries, which face a populist danger. This is discussed by Grešković in a lot of detail, and I'm now going to sum up his extremely interesting argument of showing how both critics of neoliberalism and defenders see the populist danger. I think for both of them, both groups of thinkers, it is a danger that should be avoided. But what does a danger consist of? Well, it consists of statist redistributive policies. That is perhaps the most general meaning of populism from this economic point of view. But it is also, and the one feature that is stressed by all, is import substitution industrialization. In other words, what the state does is reorient the countries involved from being exporters of raw materials, which is linked then to an oligarchic political structure. The exclusion of the producers of the raw materials from politics is particularly important there. Populism not only includes them, but also substitutes a different model of industrialization sometimes written ISI, import substitution. I just remember the previous years, all my Latin American students were always talking about import substitution, industrialization, import substitution, industrialization. In other words, substituting for the imports bought through the proceeds of our raw material exports, we will produce these things ourselves. Industrial policy, yes, but it will focus not on facilitation of exports and the exploitation of exporting labor, but will focus on the increase of productivity, the welfare, the social rights, even in many cases, most cases, of the producers of those goods which will substitute for the imports. You know all this, all of you know this. Well, not all of you are Latin American. In fact, nobody at the present moment in the class is from Latin America, so you will not know this as intimately as any Latin American student would know. But it is what not only what is described as populism for the poor capitalist countries of Latin America, but this is what was feared by Jeffrey Sachs and Balcerovich and Janos Kornai and the whole economics profession, to be really clear about this, both in Barbara's countries and in Joanna's country. I don't know about the economic profession in the rest of Central Europe, but in these two countries, the profession is simply taken over by those who advocate policies of immediate stabilization, privatization, and marketization of every single dimension of economic life, who feared, rightly or wrongly, that this set of policy options, often summed up under the very loose term of neoliberalism and the geographically correct term of Washington consensus, is what populism would challenge if it came to power. And some authors, against whom Bela Grashkovich carries on a polemic, believe that the populist response, O'Donnell's cycle, coming also to Central Europe, is almost unavoidable because of the costs of neoliberal adjustment, which are worth paying as far as Jeffrey Sachs is concerned, not worth paying as far as David Ost is concerned. These are the poles of the interpretation that Gershkovich focuses on. But in any case, the result is likely to be a disruption of the neoliberal policy option. As against stability, the populists will focus on growth. If they come to power, this is now argued only from the point of view of the advocates of the neoliberal program. If they come to power, they will disregard macroeconomic constraints, produce huge inflation, and in the end hurt the very people whom they supposedly are going to help. This is the economic meaning of populism, at least in a given historical period, probably starting from the 1950s all the way to the Central European transitions. You will find versions of this argument in all our countries, Barbara's country, Joanna's country, but of course, above all, in the Western literature dealing with the same problem. The literature of the Western advisors, if you want. You will find some criticisms of the strategy too, relatively seldom. David Ost, I think, would be for Poland the most interesting one. In a Hungarian case, I can't think of an equivalent critic who wants neither the populist outcome nor the neoliberal stabilization, but to some extent, I made some of the arguments, at least in the early 1990s. Defining populism in this way, from our point of view now, retrospective point of view, uh, uh, obviously had the flaw of disregarding that populism, needs host ideologies, and that there can be different host ideologies for it, right? Uh, the implicit argument, never really said openly, but of course it is thought by people like Sachs, at least at that time, is that the host ideology, the only host ideology relevant, is a kind of social democracy. It's Keynesian social democracy, the Keynesian social welfare state idea, which the poor Latin Americans will never realize in the way that the much more advanced Scandinavians have realized it, since they were able to also apply some criteria of economic rationality in order to make sure that the problems of inflation and destabilization will not occur. The Latin Americans won't be able to avoid all that. So they're using social democratic host ideology, and in the process disregarding even Keynesian theory, because of course Keynes himself is aware of the problem of inflation and everything else that could happen if his policies were applied. That doesn't mean that social democracy was able to avoid some of the same dilemmas, but clearly it would be more catastrophic in the Latin American context. And although, of course, it was also argued in the Central European cases. But this is not the only host ideology imaginable. We have mentioned already here nationalism, and that could be a host in a racist, ethnocentric way, and even in a civic way. But what is interesting for today is that it turns out that we need to take into account the possibility of neoliberalism itself being a host ideology, as you see in the very nice essay of Kenneth Roberts. Even this becomes possible. Now, in order to make a full sense of Greshkovich's argument, we need to not simply identify his perspective with the economic literature of his time, but focus on his specific contributions. Certainly, the idea that economic populism would have an inflationary impact, that it would damage the classes supposedly helped, that it would actually lead to potential economic disaster. There Greshkovich takes from the literature. But as against the literature, not just the economic literature, but also those political scientists like Adam Przeworski and Jon Elster, who to an important extent rely on it, Greshkovich wants to suggest that there are some things we learn from Latin America that make the phenomenon inapplicable in the Central European cases. One is that populist policy making is not possible where the recession is too deep and the macroeconomic instability is too radical. He shows empirically, and I think this is really nice that a Central European has paid so much attention to Latin America. He shows empirically, in terms of the use of econometrics, that the moment of populist policy making in Latin America was always at moments when the recession was relatively mild, if it existed at all, and macroeconomic instability, as measurable by inflation and balance of payments weaknesses, was on the whole absent. So the conclusion is that populist policymaking requires relative stability and macroeconomic balance. This paradoxically means that a neoliberal policy of adjustment could lead to populism, but only after it has been fully carried out. Interestingly, Gershkovich does not draw this conclusion because he, in fact, back then predicted that there would be no populism, successful populism in Central European cases. But in any case, he does produce two reasons, even though he does not predict anything on their basis, that a neoliberal adjustment could lead to populism. One reason is its success, creating macroeconomic stability. And the second reason is where it will fail, because it will produce victims as well as winners. It will produce victims and inequality due to this distinction between winners and losers. So there will be people who will be interested in it, and there will be macroeconomic conditions that would allow it. If you only made this argument, Bela would have predicted populism someplace down the line, populist economics. That would be partially right and partially wrong, because the populism we see in Central Europe primarily is not economic populism, but still there will be populist successes. And even in the countries where populist governments do not form or populist regimes are not created, there is a significant populist presence and has been. A country like Slovakia, for example, already from the 90s, Mečiar was prime minister and had populist views. So the thing was already present. Gershkovich does not, however, predict it because of his interest in polemicizing against the literature. And so his argument in terms of prediction goes in two directions. One of them is extremely interesting, and I haven't said it yet, namely that communism in many respects resembles populism defined in an economic sense. Let me point to the actual text on page 106 of the volume. He lists 7 things by which at least late communist economic policy resembled populism, and it has to do with appeal to organized labor and urban white-collar groups, full employment and comfortable wages, import substitution. Being closed economies, they were import substitutionists to begin with. Strong preference for the public over the private sector, so much so that hardly any private sector in some of the state socialist countries. The creation of budget deficits to stimulate aggregate demand. This is characteristic only of the very late crisis period of the state socialist countries. You know that Poland, Hungary become countries among the most heavily indebted to international lenders. This resembles populism in a way. One should distinguish between historical periods of communist rule, because some of the criteria which Gershkovich stresses are early phenomena: the egalitarianism, the redistributionist aspect, the social welfare aspect, and some other phenomena like borrowing are late phenomena. He kind of, on this page, brings together things from different historical periods, but these are all well known to East Europeans and Central Europeans, and the attraction of something like economic populism was relatively low. This, I think, he proves. Certainly the economics profession of which he was a part, I don't know, maybe in Poland and Hungary you could find at some university job somebody wedded to populist political views, but certainly in the dominant sectors of the profession, it is really generally absent. And the population too is doubtful about many of the features that would characterize economic populism. This is the new part of Gershkovich's argument. concerning why not in Central Europe. The second argument I already made, namely that the crisis is just simply too deep, and it is not the moment in which the thing could be introduced. This, of course, does not mean that there are not people around who seem to talk as populists. Greshkovich, because he understands the phenomenon primarily in the economic sense, thinks that it is just talk on their part. So Čurka in Hungary, Torjan in Hungary, Mečiar in Slovakia, Walesa himself, sometimes in Poland, and Tymiński even more in Poland, that's just talk. And Greshkovich has proof of that, because at least one of these gentlemen does come to power, Lech Walesa. He's elected as president. And under the transitional arrangements in Poland, he has lots of powers in picking a government. And who does he pick to be economic czar? Leszek Balcerowicz, the same architect of the shock just previously, whom he attacked. I don't know if in person, Walesa tended to be very polemical, and he may have attacked Balcerowicz by name, but whether he attacked him or not, he implied a polemical attitude to what was being done. And yet, these are the people he appoints. And once Balcerowicz resigns, he picks an even more determined libertarian in economics to replace him. I think Bielecki is the name of, Joanna might remember the name. Lucky, I can't believe that I could recall it. But in any case, it was someone named Bielecki. And so this is what often is in the literature called bait and switch. You get elected as a populist, and you choose a neoliberal. To my friend Bela, though, this means that it was never real. The populism was never real. This is the view where I criticize him. He's not here to defend himself. He, I'm sure, would do a wonderful job. But in any case, this is where I asked him why he has not shifted from an economic to a political definition of the phenomena. And this is what I want to turn now. I can't do it with his help. And so I use Kenneth Roberts, relying not only on the one piece which you just now read, which is excellent on Fujimori's version of doing a different kind of populism. But there's another essay, much less readable and much more difficult. Maybe this is why Udipta chose the one on Peru, which is a very brilliantly written and well limited essay. Left and Right, I don't know the full title now, is an essay in the Carlos de la Torre Rutledge Handbook, where Roberts presents his views in much more detail. The dates, of course, are quite different. 1995 for the original piece. It already then, at the time Greshkovich writing his essays, is redefining populism as something more than just the economic. And Greshkovich refers to him in the text. But the second essay in 2019 puts the whole thing on a much more general and developed foundation. But in the 1995 essay already, though, Robert speaks about the exhaustion of the ISI, the import substitution industrialization method, that the neoliberal reforms undermine the fiscal basis and the union organizations, which a populism of the old type would depend on. And so one needs a different kind of perspective. When he first introduces the political perspective, he suggests that the early versions of this still included within the political perspective the economic, but this he wants to break with, and one can break with it because whereas traditional populism had its political basis in a specific class, namely agrarian and industrial workers, or even more industrial workers who are recent arrivals in the city from the countryside. And now one can speak about a populism which relies more generally on different subaltern classes, and in the Peruvian case specifically, no longer on workers at all, but on the precariat. There are workers in Peru, both in agriculture, who are wage laborers, and in industry, but populism finds, it's also always nice when Caesar is there because he always tells me the percentage of Peru's population, which is part of the precariat. I always say over 50%. And Caesar at this point, when he's there, he says 70%. For Fujimori, who was himself a Peruvian, not a member of the precariat, we don't usually consider university deans members of the precariat. Even Will Milberg, whatever else one can say about him, is a member of a cultural elite. I'm talking about the new school, which not everybody here is a member of. Fujimori was certainly a member of an elite, but he felt, and it turned out to be right, that his ethnic difference, namely being Japanese in a country where Asians were a minority, he could address the precariat in a particularly plausible way. And so in this sense, a shift in addressees has been possible during the episode. And I think a shift of this type at least partially occurs in the other Andean countries as well, depending on the cultural ethnic makeup. Who is going to be addressed is going to change. Let us say in Venezuela, it is more like a precariat of the Peruvian type, whereas in Bolivia, it is the indigenous who will be the primary addressees. But in any case, Carlos de la Torre has a right to speak in all these settings about a process of the second incorporation. Peronism, Cardenismo, Vargismo, I don't know, Vargismo, how do you pronounce it in Portuguese, are crises of the first incorporation. What is taking place now is the second incorporation after the initial have been incorporated, but it is not identical to the counter mobilization stressed by Gino Germani in any of these cases. So it is a repetition rather than a counter phenomenon. The precariat is not mobilized against industrial workers, as some sectors of the middle class and the peasantry would be under fascism. They are just mobilized for the first time, in the case of the indigenous, brought into politics for the first time because previously their lives proceeded in the traditional manner, which even colonialism only destabilized but did not destroy. Now, what it's important to see that Roberts, it's not so clear in the essay that you read, has already shifted to a political definition. Populism is not going to be defined by redistributive economic policies, by import substitution, anything else. These are options for populism at one historical moment. Populism is going to be defined as a crisis of representation, as a response to the crisis of representation. That's the Roberts view. I discussed that in detail. I don't know if that's a text of mine I sent to you or not, but does not matter. The crisis of representation. And the crisis of representation is both a function of exclusions of workers and the precariat and the indigenous, but it is also a function of the type of political party systems that you have. Because even when everybody is included, a oligopolic or cartel form of party organization still does not represent. If parties collude among themselves to generate their policies, both out of power and especially in power, then a significant part of the population will be underrepresented. And if there are too many parties, and you find a party that seems to represent your views, the chances of those views entering into the political process are also small. So two kinds of party systems, oligarchic on the one side, and loose and amorphous pluralistic ones produce crises of representation. This is Roberts' view, and you can therefore have responses based on either traditionally excluded or newly excluded, depending on the type of party structure that you face. But you actually have to propose something. You have to do something. You have to produce an alternative. And if you're for the Peruvian case now, that's the essay that you read. If your problem is a kind of secondary corporation of the precariat, you can't offer them the same thing that you offer to industrial workers, which is unions, which is redistribution, which is minimum wages. They're small entrepreneurs, not organized. They don't have unions, and they're not interested in wages. They're interested in policies that will lower the cost of their inputs and allow them to raise the cost of their outputs, namely prices. This is very different than the policy interests of industrial workers. So, responding to a new popular basis and to the fact that the neo-social democratic version of populism, economic populism, has become historically obsolete and has led to great difficulties. Populism is transformed. But essentially, Roberts is arguing is that once you define populism from the point of view of the crisis of representation and the claims of better representation by some kind of populist subject presenting itself in terms of a specific kind of narrative, you can have different economic policies linked to it. And in the Peruvian case, very brilliantly, and I never saw this argument before, but I was impressed by it, he suggests that you could even have eclectic economic policies, and eclectic economic policies that change according to the stage of the regime, the change of the populist government. So populist economic policy can begin with a populist electoral strategy. This is Fujimori's model. I don't know about Menem in the various elections, whether in the first election did he propose to continue classical federalism or not. Surely people thought that he would continue it, given that it was the same party. And I can't say in the Mexican case whether people like Lopez Portillo or Salinas after him ever carried on a populist campaign. The significant fact, though, for the Peruvian case is that that whatever the campaign said, there is a bait and switch, because once in government, Fujimori, and certainly if Menem carried on a populist campaign, then Menem too, they fit their macro policies within the Washington consensus. In other words, the neoliberal frame. What is interesting and new for me, though, is that according to Roberts, and I have no way of testing it, and I can't ask Caesar about it, who's not here today, that after his self-coup, the very same Fujimori was forced to introduce, in order to gain support for his a new authoritarian posture, was forced to introduce a mix, macroeconomics on the level of the economy as a whole, appointing economic advisors and ministers of finance and treasury who would fit well into to the Washington Consensus frame, and at the same time, on a micro level, beginning a policy of clientelism and rewarding those sectors of the population that would be most relevant to his future electoral possibilities. He had to elect the Constituent Assembly right after his self-coup, and he dramatically improved his party position in that election with respect to his previous election. And I think he's reelected once also. And so he wants to control the electorate, and he does so through redistributive policies on a micro level, which are sufficiently restrained so that the macroeconomic picture is not dramatically worsened. I was impressed by this, and I want to catch you, Barbara, about this. I pick on people depending on countries here. Whether this type of economic mixture characterizes Orban's Orbano, I can't even make up the word, Orban economics, in the sense that at least very partially, at least in the daily press and in some literature, which is highly critical of what Orban's policies have been, I see elements of this type of mixture of welfare state-oriented policy, which has caused, for example, the workfare policy, which is produced for the weakest part of the population, and the redistribution, which allows for some people who are in key positions to control votes to enrich themselves. I can't really say much about this, but I think that if I'm right at all, then the analysis of Roberts becomes central in understanding what populism will be once the classical era of economic populism is gone. And of course, when I want to end with this part of the discussion, in order to be able to do that, you got to win elections. I mean, you can't just propose eclectic policies when you're out of power. In fact, proposing eclectic policies when you're in power makes you vulnerable in electoral campaigns. Those policies come when you're in power, when you're trying to consolidate it. But in order to get there, you have to win. And Orban learned a bitter lesson in 2002. If you don't do well, you can lose. And so the central question becomes electoral. Bela was not jumping at this in his current talk, although he anticipates the argument in the book where he suggests that people with a populist rhetoric like Dorothy or Churka, at that time he didn't think of Orban, perhaps, or maybe he did already think of him but doesn't mention him, can win elections using that rhetoric. But they will just turn neoliberal once they are in power. And this, I think, certainly can be in some very broad ways supported, even for Fujimori and Menem and so on. But the point is that under conditions of countries which were previously state socialist, an electoral strategy cannot be simply based on false promises and then radical violation of those promises subsequently. So we actually do not see, and if you look at, in a chapter I didn't assign to, Greshkovich actually looks at Dorothy and Churka in Hungary. If you look at their electoral programs, you don't really see economic populism even there. So how do they actually then win elections? Greshkovich thinks that if they win them through populist rhetoric, they would be fake populists anyway. That's not my view. But the question remains, how do they win elections? And it is here that in his talk, as well as in some essays, Greshkovich returns to the civil society argument. You heard the talk. I think all of you were there. You win elections because you learn from the previous loss. What did Orbán learn from his previous loss? He learned that he needs to be better rooted, better embedded in society. That's the term that Greshkovich uses, in order to not just win an election, but to stay in power, right? He could win an election again. That's not excluded with his defeat in 2002. But the important point now is not just to win, but to stay in power. And when he wins in 2010, he's able to stay in power in two subsequent elections. In other words, he wins 3 elections. That's a record in Hungary. There was not even a record of 2 previously, was there? Actually, the socialists win an election. Yes, they did it once.
They win, but it was 3 different prime ministers in the 8 years. So it was just the party that remained. Not
right. So it happened once before, a second election, but no one won 3. That's for sure. So in this sense, it's what we used to call an Olympic record that Orbán sets up. And he thought about this a lot. And he was in good position to think about it, having written already his master's thesis about civil society. I had a chance to lecture to the Bibo Collegium. I think it was in 90, or no, I think it was in 88, really. It was earlier, 88 or 89. No, 88, when he was still a student there. And I lectured on civil society. I don't think I was the one who got him interested in the topic, but I surely might have influenced him. In any case, he remained a civil society guy. And this is what Greshkovich discovers in his essay on the civic circles. Now, we didn't assign that essay, but he presented the basic idea of it in his lecture. The term circles comes from István Bibo, a Hungarian theorist. Actually, István Churka, an earlier Hungarian radical populist, already used the term. So Orbán realized something that he already knew through his academic work, namely that organizing from below can be a very powerful instrument, both in helping you to come to power, winning elections, but more importantly, in staying in power once you have won an election. And so the so-called civic circles are indeed organized, and it would be interesting to see whether that lesson has been now learned also by the critics of Orbán. I don't know, Barbara, if you know this volume, Támogatás és Támadás. It is just coming out, edited by Eötvös and Sikra. Sikra will be our lecture this Friday. This volume is on civil society now in Hungary, focusing on feminism. And I think the title already indicates an ambivalent position with respect to the Orbán regime. Támogatás means support, and Támadás means attack, support and attack. And this ambivalence indicates already that Orbán, having relied on civil society to come to power and to stay in power, is not able to simply suppress civil society. You have to make sure it becomes the right kind of civil society. And that's difficult. And in that sense, it will be a question not for us today, whether oppositions in these countries, Poland, Hungary, in the United States, I know the answer, have to rely not just on electoral strategies, but also on mobilization from below. I think in the United States, the so-called resistance played a significant role in the electoral victory of 2008 already. 2018 already. And the fact that Nancy Pelosi can create help create a new persona of a more inclusive and better coordinated Democratic Party is made possible precisely by that electoral, by those forms of civil resistance and self-organization. Somebody will write this study of the defeat of Trump from 2017 on, but since at least my daughter was participating quite enthusiastically in this resistance, it's possible, I think, for me to see how the civil dimension, which perhaps a populist like Trump could rely, but no perhaps about it. The Tea Party is the civic circles of the United States, and indeed, Orban, in this sense, can be considered a kind of pioneer. I'm not sure now the date when maybe one of you will remember when I guess the Tea Party was from 2008 or 2009 in response to Obama's first victory. Adam or Callie can help me. Sydney, David, there's several people from the U.S. in the class. I think 2009 is the formation of the Tea Party. And so in that sense, the American right anticipated even, the civic circles are 2002 in Hungary. So the Hungarian move is earlier, but I think that these are independent discoveries in the two settings. Whether there's something equivalent in Poland, I can't judge. But I would suspect that in a country where civil society-based mobilization was so important in the overcoming of communism, it was an important factor as well. Nevertheless, and this is my contention with Bela, civil society self-organization was not a sufficient basis for Orban to win, nor is it going to be a sufficient basis for us to beat him. You're getting what I'm saying. He resisted this. On this level, I find the Hungarian participants in all this, not the students, not Barbara, but the older ones, to be very pessimistic, full of old-style Hungarian doom and gloom, we say in English. It's going to be a long-term strategy, and who knows how we're going to do it. This was Bela's view. I felt it's not my nature to think that way ever. It's very Hungarian. Barbara knows. This is what we do in Hungarian bars. We drink and we are sad together. There's even a word for this. Együtt szomorkodni. Együtt vagyunk szomorúak. We are sad together. Being sad ensemble. I don't think it's a Polish thing, Joanna, this type of thing, but the Russians have it. So it is something perhaps you inherit from some of the Slavs of collective being sad. I didn't want to say this to him. He would have been really insulted had I accused him of this. But I had that kind of feeling, what Béla, are we being sad together? Együtt szomorkodunk itt, hogy most nem lehet ezeket megverni. It's impossible, right? Not to be able to defeat a thing like that in Hungary. To me, that's absurd. This is the country of 1848. This is the country of 1956. Of course we can beat them. And we beat much bigger enemies, much more powerful enemies, right? The Habsburgs. Well, we didn't beat the Romanovs in 1949, but that's a question of the dwarf and the giant fighting. But we did beat the Habsburgs. That wasn't bad. And in 56, in spite of everything, we rose up against the Soviets. So what is all this doom and gloom? Well, you have to win an election. That's the secret, and he doesn't think they're going to do it. I was reading Mérce today, a Hungarian left-wing publication, and it seemed to me that it could be done, just on the basis of what they are saying. And that's what we have to actually think about. But in election, see, on a level of civil society, what Béla said was right. Self-organization is a goal in itself. It's a good in itself. In fact, civil society, in this sense, has two faces. One is the political phase, trying to influence politics. We write about this in Gene, in our book. But it has another face, namely self-organization as an end in itself. I think that this volume on women, Támogatás és Támadás, is about that. It's not about how we're going to influence or transform the political system. It's about how we're going to organize ourselves. And that is indeed a goal. But if you are living under a increasingly authoritarian system, that goal in itself is insufficient. And even that goal cannot be carried out because they know also how to manipulate and disorganize the civil to an important extent. So they have to be beaten. And I think elections are the only way. Now, in order to win elections, and I will end with Roberts, you have to know also how they won their election. And Roberts, in the other essay, the one that I did not assign to you, is more helpful here because he points to the axes of competition. And there are two axes in his argument. He has these very fancy terms. I never heard them before. I'm not such a good social scientist. I don't read them unless I must. Positional as against valence competition. I don't remember even who he gets this from. But to put into simple human language, the positional is the economic. Positions on the level of economic policy. With redistributive social democratic policies being the left-wing dimension, the left-wing position, and the libertarian version of neoliberalism is the most right-wing position there. And the problem here was for not just populists, but also social democratic lefts, is then in the current, or perhaps the last epoch, which is now becoming perhaps the past epoch, if you look at the United States, in the past epoch, it was impossible to present plausible formulas on the left. And this was not only because of pure economics. I think that Béla would say it is ultimately for economic reasons. But in any case, whether that's true or not, and I'm not entirely sure, it is also true for political reasons because of the emergence of third way or new democracy or neoliberal social democracy in almost all the countries of the Western world. This is part of the Cardinal Party phenomenon, but it exists even where there is a dramatic pluralization of political parties. Yes, it is going to be theoretically possible for populists to occupy the empty space. It's called positional outflanking by Roberts. Theoretically possible, but they have to do this in a plausible way. And so far as I can see, this was done in a plausible way only in energy-rich countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Natural gas in the second two countries, a great deal of oil in the first, and natural gas also in Venezuela. countries that could use their very extensive resource base in the context of high international prices at that time, not so much now, to finance something like economic populism. So positional outflanking is possible, but you have to be able to base it on some kind of, this is Bela's point, some kind of position of financial integrity. And that could be done, at least for a while, in Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, most of all. Already couldn't be done in Colombia, interestingly enough. So even the oldest Latin American countries, and I think in Peru, it was not really possible either. So even in the same geographical region, it took very specific economic situations to do this. But there's another option, and that's shifting to the cultural axis, the other valence, because people are not just interested in economic welfare and economic policy. In my conception, I go with Roberts and define populism first and foremost as a political phenomenon, which is facilitated in the context of weaknesses or crises of representation. But I also say, and this is consistent with his views too, at least implicitly, that in order for representation deficit to become salient, you also need to have grievances either on a level of economics or on a level of culture. Now, what Roberts himself tells us is that which grievance counts can be changed. How? Well, it can be changed, first of all, by historical developments. It could be that it is economic and historical changes that produce a precariat with very specific type of economic and cultural grievances. It can also be that political mobilization on the left produces grievances on the right. This is what you see in the case of Trump's base, is that mobilization by feminists, ecologists, and various kinds of modern radical liberals has produced feelings of exclusion and grievance on the other side. The historical context can be different in different settings, but in any case, it is a rather common phenomenon that those who have cultural grievances consider the previous ruling elites to be friendly to some kind of underclass, whether ethnically based or racially based, or even connected to immigration processes. But whatever it is, this sentiment is mobilizable. And once it is mobilized, people are willing to forget about their economic grievances. So this means that there can be a populism defined politically as a representation deficit that can shift its own grievance reference or its own reference to grievances from economic ones to cultural ones. And what happens, as I think Roberts tells us in that longer essay, which I would recommend to you, about left-right and the kinds of competition that lead to populist challenges, the most likely option will be the production of a narrative, Laclau would call it a chain of equivalences, which will bring together some economic with some cultural grievances in a package of promises that create the basis of an electoral majority. Okay, I stop. Floor is open. Adam, please start it.
Yeah, I have a small question.
Small. Okay.
Under your notes on Gruskevitz's arguments for prediction, there's a brief note on lacking in factors needed for collective violence. And I don't understand what you mean by that. And I also don't understand how to think about that in terms of the last 10 minutes of your lecture. Is that a opinion that has been just thoroughly moved past as we come to...
You are very observant. And, I write these lectures in such a way that I write first a lecture in terms of an outline, then I begin to fill things in, then I fill in more, and then I look back at the books again to see what I left out. And this is, you called it, this is something that Bela Greshkovich mentions, but I left it out. I didn't like it so much. It has a little bit, I don't want to accuse him of this, but it has a little bit of a cultural prejudice that the Latin Americans are more prone to violence than we are. And so they are ready to organize movements which are indeed violent and therefore put elites under certain kinds of pressure. And we don't seem to have that. I'm a historian and also even an East European historian very early in my career. I don't think that the history of Hungary and Poland could be used to justify such claims of general nonviolence. I think Joanna and Barbara will agree with me that we have plenty of violence in our stories, even the Holocaust, right? Which cannot just be blamed on the Germans in either country, right? And this is a debate everywhere, but that we got lots of violence in our past. But it is true that the defeat of communism is really very dramatically nonviolent. And I think that, I don't know how much of Gandhi was read by the actual figures. Adam Michnik, I'm sure, has read Gandhi because he read everything. I don't know, Janos Kish, close friend of mine, these were the leaders at that time and who really were very, very much into nonviolence. They didn't get it through Gandhi or even Martin Luther King directly. I know these gentlemen. I think they got it through a very sound strategic consideration. And I think they even said this, right? 1956, we tried it. Where did it end up? With a massacre, deportations, repression, jailing, a disaster. Michnik writes this exactly, and he's not Hungarian, and the Poles were not so violent in 1956. But, Hungary was close to their heart. We always had a Hungarian-Polish thing. Of all the various Slavic countries, Hungary has an eternal friendship with Poland. The Poles are not quite as friendly to us as we are to them. We invited István Báthory to be our king. The Poles never invited any Hungarian to be their king. Perhaps they were right about that. But István Báthory was a great king, so that was a good choice. What's the century? 14th or 15th, Barbara, right? Early 15th, maybe. I used to be, a historian of these things. So we have this thing, and we learning at least 56 was important to the Polish writers too. So that's not the way to do it. So the nonviolence comes from that. But I don't think that the pattern should be in particular referred to when we're dealing with the possibility of populism. And indeed, in lots of Latin American countries, populism is not a violent phenomenon. Violence is not the way populists come to power, and it is not always the way they stay in power. And so I added it for the sake of justice because he says it, but I think I should have just let it out. So Adam, you hit on an issue which is interesting, but in fact, it was a mistake for me to include that. So you get another chance because I see your hand again.
Yeah, I want to follow up on this point. At the very end, you mentioned that, populists are not brought into power. They don't stay in power with violence. For whatever reason, your phrasing made me think of this, but that seems uniquely weird because populists have unprecedented levels of access to a mass of precariat people who traditionally have been the ones that are the fodder for the military, right?
Sure.
They have the means to assemble huge militaries. So if they have that direct access in ways that so many leaders do not, why do we not see them sort of shift towards pulling those masses into the
Well, it's an empirical matter, right? And you're right. For example, if we go a little bit further east from Hungary, a country that used to occupy us for 180 years, namely Turkey, at that time Ottoman Empire, you see much more violence. I mean, a good friend of mine, Osman Kavala, has been in jail for 3 years now. For doing what? For doing civil society patronage in Turkey. And there are a lot of journalists in jail. There are people who are afraid to go back to Turkey because of that. Now, how many people did Orban jail? The answer is very simple. As far as I can tell, 0. Now, maybe that's wrong, right? Because when it comes down to the grassroots,
there was this scandal when they jailed Csaba Ceglédi, a oppositional member. I think he was the member of the parliament from the Sombor region, and then his rights were suspended, and there was a case, like my friend was with him, he defended him in the European court. So that was one, but since then
and I leave out the police measures against the Roma. You know, it's not just a question of people like Osman Kavala, who is a millionaire and a high intellectual, who I of course would know about. You know, in Turkey, during, for example, the so-called coup attempt of 2016, there's quite a lot of violence against crowds, against people on the street. And on this level, I think violence against the Roma, but this, of course, is not just Orban. This was under the previous governments as well. It's not that has he increased it? Maybe not even, because people are more afraid to even protest or to show themselves on the street. So he may not even actually have increased it, since the chances of it are greater now than they would have been then. So I should be careful with this, of this nonviolent stuff. But it is nevertheless interesting, right, that this new populism wins elections which are free and fair according to existing electoral rules. They begin to play with these once in power, but have not yet quashed them. Once they do, like in the case of Putin in Russia, I think we would have to consider whether the term populism is still relevant. And of course, in the case of Russia, there's a lot of violence. Did I mention India in the case in that thing that you referred to? Where is the text? I'm not even sure if I can actually now find it. Why not in Eastern Europe? No, I didn't mention lacking factors needed for violent collective action. I didn't mention, but it would be an interesting question with respect to India, where religious antagonism has been used for mobilizing purposes, and that antagonism has very often taken a violent form. So I think the question of violence in terms of the various populist governments and regimes, if there are regimes that we can consider, Duterte in the Philippines, there's lots of violence. In fact, there's a war on drugs which is organized primarily in terms of executions and imprisonment without fair trials of people considered to be the targets. So I think that the answer, and this is a weasel answer to Adam, is that this will depend on the context. And I don't mean to put this in terms of ethnocultural terms, you know, that Hungary is a non-violent country as against Argentina, which is violent. I don't know if I, first of all, buy such a cultural distinction. And secondly, I think that that is not the major factor here. But yes, violence is something that certainly Greskovic stresses, and I think although it doesn't really work for the explanation, it could be taken into account. First of all, of course, is violent collective action is the biggest threat to populists. I think that they themselves seem to be very concerned about nonviolent action, like university occupation, like demonstrations, like the activities of NGOs that can have some foreign funding and so on. These are the things they focus on. I don't know if it's violent action that is stressed in their discourse, violent action of their adversary. I'm not. Yeah, of course. I mean, going back to the Hungarian case, I'm sure there's talk of Roma criminality, right? Just as Trump talked about illegal immigrant criminality. So in that sense, the fear of violence is kind of used in these packages. It's not the violence of the elites who were in power before, but it is people whom those elites have supported and patronized. Okay, anybody else? And I imagine you can see the structure of my argument, right? I start out with the idea that there is not going to be populism in Central Europe, which even Greskovic doesn't claim in this kind of way, in this very explicit way, although the way he defines it, there is an implication that true populism or genuine populism might be used as an electoral strategy, but it will not really happen. And so then what I do is to say that if you redefine populism, as almost everybody now does, in the political terms, then this prediction has to be re-examined. Then I say that Greskovic already re-examined that prediction by turning to civil society in his argument. And then I say that that's insufficient because civil society neither could bring populists to power on its own, nor remove them from power on its own. And so we have to then pay attention to electoral strategies, which imply two possibilities, either occupying the space left open by other parties or by shifting the axis of antagonism. That's my argument for today. So what do you think of that? Right, wrong, implausible, plausible? What's wrong with it? I'm sorry I don't have Greskovic here because he would, I'm sure, produce an answer. It would be along with Halmai that the outcome I'm speaking about is not genuine populism anymore. Right? That would be the disagreement. Halmai, you remember, also talked about real and fake populism, following Isaiah Berlin. I debated with him on that too. And Greskovic doesn't quite do that, but he seems to say, right, that if this is the way they come to power, it's going to be some kind of deception. And it will be genuine populism as a rhetoric, maybe, but fake populism as a form of governance. So there's no populism really in government. Now, there used to be as long as economic populism worked, but there isn't one now. These are not really populists, they're just autocrats. I think this is what Halme said. And Janos Kish, probably, whom I invited to lecture in the lecture series, probably thinks the same. And you know, that's the question. Is Fujimori a genuine populist in his second phase, in the way I presented him? Is that still populism? Yeah, Akansha, please.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about neoliberal policymaking and economic populism. I was largely thinking of this in the Indian context with Modi, but I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
All right. So here are the three dimensions of that. Two stressed by Greshkovich and one by Robert. Great, Akansha. Very good. This is good. I can develop something that I didn't really develop enough before. So in the first two levels, neoliberalism, in Greshkovich's view, comes to power when populism is not possible. Because populisms, and this is a cyclical model, has produced disasters in Latin America. I went to Argentina in 2001. I mean, literally, you couldn't exchange money. You could not do anything, even if you were willing. I didn't have cash, but the banks broke down so much that they were not able to even carry on transactions of that type. So that was the most extreme case, but you have serious crises in all the classical import substitution countries. So the first thing that happens is that neoliberalism becomes the only option. You remember the term TINA. I joked with Greshkovich about that. There is no alternative. I hate this term because it's so against everything that I think. There is no alternative, right? But this was what people thought. You know, Leszek Balcerowicz, you pronounce him right, it's a ch. And Leszek is a sh, because you do it reverse from us. So Leszek Balcerowicz, he is a leader in the workers' control section of Solidarity in 1980 to 81. Workers' control, of course, is not a direct opposite of neoliberalism in the sense that it is not redistributionist automatically, but you kind of assume that workers in control are going to interfere with macroeconomic outcomes by giving them sort of relatively high salaries, by not fostering a labor market that will make others sell their labor for very little money, and So workers' control is not quite the opposite, but it is pretty near the other pole of this positional axis. And the same man is the architect, along with Jeffrey Sachs, who was the foreign advisor, of the shock. And so in this sense, you can say that people, as I always say, with strong left-wing sensibility, and that goes from Adam Michnik and Yasser Kuron, all the rest. They were my heroes at the time. Janos Kish too. They are left-wingers, not state socialist left-wingers. They are democratic leftists of one type or another. Even the civil society argument was really developed by leftists. I mean, after all, Gramsci, right, who is mentioned by Greshkovich in his presentation. That was funny. You have Gramsci's picture and Orban as a young, handsome man superimposed on another. Gramsci was never handsome, poor dear, but Orban was. In any case, that's where they come from. And yet, in 1989, they accept TINA. There is no alternative. I tried to suggest at the time, there's no alternative for 1 or 2 years. That was my view of this. But of course, once you've done this crazy thing, you have to shift to a democratic socialist program of some kind. And I wrote that down and so on, and had no effect, of course, on anybody. But in any case, that was my view. It was over-optimistic, because once you were caught in that paradigm, to shift to this other thing was not very plausible. And you look at the history of the party which I supported, Alliance of Free Democrats, SDS in Hungarian initials, they moved themselves from what was originally a kind of social liberalism to a Thatcherite version. So yes, that was the first appearance of neoliberalism. Now, in Greshkovich's analysis, the success of neoliberalism could get rid of the need for it. That was kind of my view too. And Greshkovich, though without referring to me, seems to suggest that would be possible because populism, which was not my alternative certainly, populism was impossible only as long as the stabilization has not occurred, the inflation has not been conquered, the companies and the firms involved have not been rationalized, the property system has not been improved, and all these things we talked about back then, and there still remain interesting topics. Now, once that all of that is done, then you could have populism. In my view, you could have had democratic socialism of some kind. We'll talk about that topic maybe next time. But in any case, Greshkovich adds the very, very interesting feature, though, that the neoliberal stabilization process will create victims too. I said that already in the lecture. And so not only will it be economically possible, but it will be sociologically possible to organize populist protest and perhaps even a populist political party. It won't happen, he thought, back in '98, because communism itself was too close to populism and so on. It doesn't matter. But the one option that he doesn't really admit, and I think this is what your question or question is ultimately about, is that there could be a synthesis between neoliberalism and populism. Now, Valenza did not work it out in 1990, 91, when he challenged the Mazowiecki government, and certainly István Csurka and Dorothy in Hungary did not have proposals to this effect, but Alberto Fujimori worked it out. This is Roberts' piece, and you could combine electoral strategy and governance, bifurcate them, and you could even within governance find room for both neoliberalism and populist appeal. How about this work? I'm not really a direct student of Peruvian politics and society and economy. Once Fujimori has attempted this, his scandals had to do with corruption above all. Well, maybe corruption is part of this, right? Because I said that the way you combine, and this is how I interpret Orbán, the way you combine the neoliberal policy with aspects of redistribution is focused on, well, there are three possible foci. One foci is the group which is your immediate base. You see this most clearly in Marine Le Pen, who says, yes, welfare state, but only for true French people, not for Turks, not for Arabs, not even for Poles and Hungarians, who according to the EU should be beneficiaries if they happen to move to France. No, only for true French people. So that's one possible answer. I don't know if Modi does this in India, or whether he pushes some aspects of redistribution, but only for his Hindu base. But again, that would be one possible option. Another thing you can do is to combine repression and redistribution for the underclass. I only noticed for Hungary that there are workfare programs. You can get a minimum amount of income to allow you not to starve to death, but you got to do lots of work for it. Barbara can tell you what that's like. I'm sure that this is something that no one would do willingly if they didn't have to. But in any case, that's the second thing. And then the third thing you can do with redistribution is to create opportunities for those who are going to control economy and society and the vote, quite specifically. That's the stress. That's what Bálint Magyar stresses in his mafia state idea. And this is the dimension of corruption, which I think you can find in all populists. Now, in Fujimori's case, I don't know about the workfare. I don't know about whether true Peruvians received some kind of redistributive advantages. Who are they supposed to be anyway in a country which is a combination of indigenous, mestizo, mulatto, and white? Who are the true Peruvians? I don't know if that language was even used, but in any case, there's corruption in Fujimori's Peru, and that was the step for his downfall. Now, you could say that that workfare and redistribution for the benefit of an ethnic group are not really compatible with neoliberalism. It's a question whether neoliberalism in theory or in practice is compatible with sectors of the population enriching themselves, having governmental advantages. Usually this is called crony capitalism, so even this is not compatible with neoliberalism on paper. But is it compatible with neoliberalism in practice? I mean, you know, when I was a kid or even a young man, you know, we said millionaire in the United States when we wanted to describe very rich people. There were even songs. Better coffee millionaires money won't buy. There was an advertisement for chock full of nuts, a coffee that no person in his or her right mind would drink today because we can buy fresh beans and grind them, right? But chock full of nuts is the coffee. I don't know if any of you Americans remember it. Better coffee, even millionaires' money can buy. Now, today the song would not say millionaires. Today the song would say billionaires. No one says millionaires anymore. I mean, really, people with very modest incomes can be on paper millionaires today, right? But billionaires is what we talk about, and we look at the number of billionaires around who became that wealthy in this period. Now, is that supposed to happen? Well, there's two neoliberal issues. One is that you're not supposed to give them governmental advantages that allow it to happen. But the other is you're not supposed to regulate them in such a way that it cannot happen. So I think neoliberalism is torn with respect to this old idea of enrich yourself. That was Guizot who coined that phrase in the 19th century in France. And at one stupid moment, Bukharin used this term too. But the neoliberals don't say enrich yourselves. Nevertheless, deregulation allows it to happen. I mean, even the tax policies allow it to happen, right? Because this famous race to the bottom means we are not even taxing these people. You know, people like George Soros says, please tax me. And I think even Bill Gates and Bezos supposedly have the position that they should be taxed much, much more than they actually are. But in any case, they are not. So the tax policies of neoliberals And why is the tax policy of neoliberalism this way? Because their idea of social policy is, as Bela said in his talk, trickle down. The way you help people below is to allow the gains and the wealth to trickle down from the top. So in this sense, even if corruption is not a part, something like the emergence of groups and people who are able to then buy governments and elections almost necessarily follows from this Washington consensus model of how to organize the economy. So in some sense, then neoliberalism is a political model that both is able to preempt populism in some way when in power, and at the same time open to the door to populism in a variety of ways. And the unexpected outcome is that the two perspectives can actually be synthesized. Anybody else? We have time for one or two more. Did I answer your question, or did you have something else that? Well, let's get back to this Tina, which is a preparation for the next. I think that the idea that between neoliberal stabilization and policy making in the longer term and economic populism, that there is no alternative to these two, is certainly one that was introduced pretty emphatically by the generation of 1989 and 1990, especially in the economics profession. It was an option, it was a formula that was taken over by politicians. You can see the behavior of German politicians during the Greek crisis as essentially dominated by this antagonism. Yes, many of them, German politicians, many of them being social democrats, they know that something else existed in the past, namely classical social democracy, but that belongs to the post-World War II miracle. The 30 glorious years, as it's called in French, Trente Glorieuses. And the very fact of its success made it impossible. Because it created, as the arguments of the 1970s and 80s often had it, it creates a very, very large burden on the state, redistributive burden, which can no longer be added to. And as populations increase, especially as the number of the old who are dependent on redistribution increase, again, the success of healthcare systems, you can no longer proceed on that route. And so, what do you need? Well, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair say there's a third way. That was the left-wing answer to Tina. There is a third way. And I used to think on those lines too. I used to think, yes, but what would be the components of that third way? And the third way has become very much a context for the populist challenge. Magnus Marsdal, can I find the book? Very excellent essay. I don't know if it's available online. Writing about Denmark and Sweden and Norway, of all countries, the essay is beautiful. Loud values, muffled interests, third way social democracy, and right-wing populism. The volume is called Right-Wing Populism in Europe, edited by Vodak, Majid Khosravinik, and Mral. But Right-Wing Populism in Europe, Politics and Discourse, and the essay is by Magnus Marsdal. And Marsdal tries to show, and this is in line with what I presented, that the ideas of the third way just left the box of political contention empty. No one proposed redistribution. No one proposed to take care of the weakest. No one proposed reforms of healthcare in countries, United States being the most important after Clinton. Well, of course, United States, the third way did produce both the Clinton and the Obama healthcare proposal. We don't have to discuss those now. But in lots of countries which already had established healthcare systems, no one proposed to reform them. And money was taken away from them, even by social democratic governments. This creates a space on the left for the positional competition. I've modified that conception using Roberts' idea. But the issue is whether that box could be in some ways filled. In other words, whether socialism is possible, social democracy is possible in an age of neoliberalism and post-economic populism. Is there a third, as one says in Latin? Should we say tertium non datur or tertium sempre datur? A third is excluded. That's a logical principle of the excluded middle. But this is not logic. This is society. Is a third possible? Now, I think I introduced already a possible way of addressing it through Obamacare. Clearly, Obamacare is hated by the neoliberals, right? They have shown that over and over again. At the same time, it's not exactly a redistributionist program of the old type. So what would you do today? And you can see that on the American left, which is now within the Democratic Party almost exclusively, there are really two answers. Medicare for all, that's a new formula in American term, but it essentially means the national health system of the UK or of Norwegian, Danish, Swedish healthcare, which are much better than the one in the UK. Well, I shouldn't mention them in this kind of way because they're all different than one another. But the system of the United Kingdom would be the classical one of a single-payer national system where everybody pays a tax and where everybody receives healthcare according to your needs, such as they are. And that is one option. And the other option is let the market take care of it, which is a neoliberal model. And in the United States, traditionally, that meant private insurance, purely private insurance, which you should be able to buy. And your employer could provide for you if you agree when you make the employment contract. But beyond that, there is no other option. And Obamacare coming out of ideas of the third way, I don't know now. I've never really looked at the details of the Clinton proposal, but that was proposed in a context when Bill and Hillary were advocates of a third way. explicitly. Obama never committed himself to that language, but you can see that the combination of national and private elements in the program make it into a third way kind of program. We now know there are real problems with it already. And so President Biden is proposing to improve it. Will it still be a third way program? Well, I don't want to really talk about that so much, although next time in abstract terms, I do want to raise the question of what is alive and what is dead in socialism today. And that is my way of trying to answer the question whether there is a third possibility or even a fourth and a fifth. Remember, it doesn't have to be 3 or 4 or 5. Even capitalism, if you actually look at the literature on the varieties of capitalism, exists in 4, 5, 6 versions. So why should our alternative be reduced to just one, a third or a fourth, or even to the second? Okay, thank you very much.